Now let's take a closer look at this authentication token. So I'm going to grab this, copy it. Now let's go to jwt.io. This is the official website for JSON Web Tokens. So the authentication token that you saw is actually called a JSON Web Token. So over here, we have a debugger for debugging a JSON Web Token. So on the left side, you can see a JSON Web Token in the encoded format. And on the right side, you can see what it looks like when it's decoded. So let's delete what we have here and paste our authentication token. So here we have three sections: a header, a payload, and a signature. A header is just an object with two properties: alg or algorithm, which is the encryption algorithm, and type, which is set to JWT. We don't really care about the header. What we care about is the payload. So here we have a user object with four properties: user ID, name, email, and IAT, which is short for issued at. This is the timestamp of the moment when this token was generated. Okay. Now look at the signature. So here we have this function called HMAC SHA-256. This is an encryption algorithm. Now look at the arguments of this function. We're getting the header, encoding it using base 64 algorithm. Then we append a period, and then we get the payload and encode it using the base 64 algorithm one more time. So both these objects, the header and the payload, they're encoded using the base 64 algorithm. Now the result is encrypted using a private key. This private key should only be available on the server. Now here the private key is by default is set to your 256-bit secret. And that is why we have this red box on the left, because this is not the key that I used to generate this token. So here in our backend project, inside the routes folder, look at auth.js. This is the implementation of our auth endpoint. Now look over here. This is the private key that I have used to sign this token. Now in this implementation, I've hard-coded the key in the source code. This is a terrible practice. You shouldn't do this in production. If you store the key in the source code and then check it into a code repository like Git, anyone who has access to your code repository can find the key and abuse it. The proper way to store the private key is using an environment variable. I talked about this in detail in my Node course. So if I grab this key, get back here, and use this key, the red box is gone. So using this key, we can generate and validate a JSON Web Token. Okay. So now that you know what a JSON Web Token is, let's see how we can decode it to get access to the payload. And by the way, for decoding this token, we don't need this private key. The private key is only used for generating and validating the token, but not for decoding it. Okay. So here we shouldn't store any sensitive information like user's password or credit card numbers. We only have public information about the user, like their ID, their name, and their email. So now back in our frontend project, let's install a library called JWT-decode. With this library, we can decode JSON Web Tokens. All right, I'm using version 2.2.0. Now, back to our login screen. On the top, let's import a function called JWT-decode from JWT-decode. So when the user successfully logs in, instead of logging their authentication token, we want to decode it and log the user object. So here we're going to call JWT-decode, pass result.data, and then store the result in a user object. Now let's log this on the console. So here's our app. Let's log in one more time. Here in the console, you can see the user object. Beautiful. So next, we're going to store this in the app component and make it available for the entire app.